Thank you very much for that introduction, and hello and good evening, everybody. Yes, what can I say? Yeah, I have been working in public health for, well, since I left college. Not from a medical background. My background is anthropology and public health, and then anthropology and psychology, and then went into public health. So I don't see things through a medical lens particularly. So from public health, I see social, environmental, economical as the interventions which protect and prevent and promote health. And well, without going into a long therapeutic rant, I've been pretty shocked, appalled, disappointed at the catastrophic betrayal of what I considered public health to be in the context of the COVID response. So most of my professional life has been, I was in the UK NHS for 7 years before starting to work overseas, South America, Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, and then resigned in a huff in 2021. But then last year, I was lured back in as a consultant, where I was working primarily on two initiatives. One was the high-level meetings, the UN General Assembly health declarations on TB, universal health coverage, and as it was then called, PPPR, Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness and Response. It's now called the Pandemic Accord, and that's mainly what I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes. But also on our relations with the Global Fund for AIDS, TB and Malaria, which I'm sure many of you have never heard of, although a lot of your taxpayers' money is going to them. They're a big institution in Geneva and the main global source of funding for AIDS, TB and malaria research and response. I will touch on them very briefly at the end, because I think there's some relevance there, that things we need to know about. So I'm going to attempt to analyze who are the key players in global governance, what are their incentives and accountabilities, and how this can be leveraged to bring about change and better performance from our own government and institutions. My experience in public health started way back in the 1980s, particularly in the context of the AIDS response, and there are many echoes and similarities that I'm seeing. Again, as many are, lessons that have not been learned and mistakes that are being made over again. And I think this is where apparently the march in Washington on Saturday is being supported by a lot of the AIDS groups in America, because they're seeing history repeating itself in a horrifying way. And of course, that's not just from an academic perspective. This is affecting their lives catastrophically, as it is for most of us. So most of what I'm going to share, so I have been a public servant for most of my life, and therefore had to sign the Official Secrets Act. So if I say the wrong thing, someone will land in a helicopter and take me away. So I have to be a little bit careful what I say to you all. So most of what I'm going to say is in the public domain, but my opinions and perceptions obviously are my own. That we are being catastrophically failed, betrayed, and insulted on an institutional level is not an official secret. It's I think we all know that, and it's we just have to look out the window and see the evidence. So I'm not going to go over the background of COVID-19, long COVID. No one knows this stuff better than you do. But I think there are perceptions and perspectives that I've had in my professional, most recently the last year or so, working on the pandemic preparation and response, prevention response accord, that most people are not privy to, and not because it's top secret, but because the media is just not interested, and it's just not out there, and nobody knows what's going on. And the reason I think this is important is because it's one of the very few sticks we can have to hit governments over the head with. And it's one of the few points of global accountability that they do take seriously, because it's embarrassing to make a promise to do something and then be shown to fail to deliver on it. Anyway, so let me move on, if I can get the technology to work, to the presentation I'm going to use just to structure my thoughts and the talking on this. Can anyone see this? I'm trying to. Is that coming up? Yeah.
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so there's a lot in here. I will leave this with Joan afterwards. So there's a lot of links in here. So there's some. So you can go and visit the websites afterwards. So the Pandemic Accord. This is just a brief outline of what I'm going to cover. It was called the Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness and Response. And now it's just called the Accord, which I think conveniently drops words like prevention, so they don't have to do any of that if they don't want to, which they seem not to want to. I'm going to talk a little bit about who the key players are, what the current text of the Pandemic Accord says. It's depressing. What my proposed and rejected text tried to say. I was on the drafting committee for the UK government, so I wasn't throwing stones from the outside. I was theoretically in a very privileged position to be able to influence this, but I was very much a lone voice, so it didn't get included. Why is it important? What are the incentives, and why is mitigation and prevention still missing? And particularly the things that we know are so important, like indoor air quality and also health workers wearing PPE. Wouldn't that be nice? And finishing off with, what could we do? Now, I may have oversold this presentation in its rather grandiose title, so apologies in advance for that slight breach of the Trade Descriptions Act. But I think this is a missing piece of the jigsaw that most of us and most of the people involved in COVID activism are unaware is going on in the background. And yet I do think it's potentially one of the buttons we should be pushing to try and get things better, because they are so bad. It's extraordinary 4 years on that we're still in this mess. But so some of the actors in the scenario, civil society voice, and there's a very important list of non-state actors, the WHO list of non-state actors, 217 of them, most of which you won't have ever heard of, but some of them you will have, and I think they need to do more. Most at the moment, none of them have got COVID-19 on their agenda, but also press and politicians, obviously. So what is the Pandemic Accord? Okay, here's a quote from the UN Foundation website from December 2020. Well, in December 2021, all countries of the world, so basically the UN, resolved to develop an international agreement referred to as the Pandemic Accord, sometimes called the Pandemic Treaty, also called the PPPR, and now again called Pandemic Accord. How countries can better prevent pandemics from happening and respond to future health emergencies in order to protect the safety and well-being of people everywhere. Now that all sounds great, and wouldn't it have been nice if that actually was on track to deliver something meaningful and useful that we would recognise as being a positive thing?
Can
Let's see what it does.
Second, Desmond.
Please.
Our screens are still on the first slide. Are they meant to have moved on?
They are. I don't know how to.
I think if you move them on your original.
Well, that is what I'm trying to do.
Then it should move on your original. Here you are. That's changed.
Does that now say key players?
Yes.
Okay, well, apologies for the last slide you missed. It didn't say very much. It just gave the text that I summarized and the outline. So these are the key players in my perspective. Now, please forgive me, I'm not the oracle of all knowledge or truth on this, but having done this job for 30 years, you get a map of who the important players are. So obviously there's the World Health Organization, and we all know some of the huge oversights and errors that they have been responsible for over the last 4 years, particularly. Now they respond to the World Health Assembly and the Executive Board, the very complicated machinery that meets in Geneva every sort of 6 or 12 months, depending on whether it's. So there's a May World Health Assembly coming up, where the Pandemic Accord is to be presented and ratified and approved. So there isn't an awful lot of time left to influence this, but that's not the end of the game, obviously. I mean, where I think we have an opportunity, or we should have an opportunity to have a voice, is if this accord comes out and it's deeply disappointing, which I think it will be, we collectively, and I hope media, and I hope politicians, and I hope press, and I hope particularly civil society in greater numbers, speak out and say this is not good enough. Now, these non-state actors that have special relations with WHO, there's a list in that link there. I can show the list if you want. Most of them you will never have heard of, and that the World Union of Plumbing. I mean, I'd never heard of that. I'm glad the plumbers are there, because obviously safe water is an important issue for global health. Nothing is there for safe air, either outdoor or indoor, pathogen or pollution. And I think that's a huge hole in the institutions' awareness and concern focusing on this issue. And then also there's the media, and I will share with you some slides showing some of the media coverage of this process, and it is very, very focused on sort of issues around technology transfer, about equity of things like access to vaccines, as we know is important, and it has been not very well handled for COVID-19 at all, and also production and so equity, technology transfer, and the availability of vaccines have been the key sort of sticking points of the discussion. But it has meant that over the pages and pages of this document, there's almost nothing about prevention. There is nothing about clean air, and there's nothing about long COVID either. Is that moving on? Can you see this now?
Yes, it's now moved. Right, that's moved.
It's moved on to the page from the Lancet.
Yes.
Okay, so so this is it's very critical, as most people are, very, very critical. Okay, so I'm having internet wobbles. Apologies, hope it's still there. But as I just said, the main criticisms are about access to technologies, access to vaccines, knowledge and products. And that's what the very little media interest that this topic is getting is focusing on those weaknesses of the pandemic accord. Nobody is talking about the issues I mentioned earlier about air quality. Sorry, I'm trying to move on again. So this is the current. Can you see this one? Has it moved on to the WHO proposal?
Yes. Yep.
Phew. Okay. Apologies for my internet. I'm in a very remote part of France with a very poor Wi-Fi, telephone Wi-Fi 4G. It's not very good. So apologies if it fails. So in the current text, there is one mention of the word air. And it's in such a context, while addressing the collective need for clean water, energy, and air. But so no commitment, no target, no goal, no indicators of where we should be going and how we should get there. And I find that particularly disappointing in this context, obviously, because we know this is the primary way that the pathogen is spreading, but also that even by WHO's own acknowledgement, unclean air, indoor and outdoor, pathogen and pollution, is the #1 killer globally, with about 9 million deaths a year. So the fact that they can say that in some parts of their publications, and then say nothing in the important parts of their publications, I find is not really good enough, and that's where I think we should be flagging this up. So in the current agreement of the pandemic text, there are 2 mentions of COVID, but very vague, again, with very little commitment and targets to do things better and how to do them better. But and again, particularly in this context of access to medical and other products, vaccines, oxygen supplies, PPE, diagnostics, therapeutics, all very important, not denying that, but to have a total blind spot about the ongoing transmission of this pathogen, and therefore any future pandemic pathogen, I think is disastrous. I think it's a failure of the fundamental focus of what this negotiation and declaration should be looking at. So here we go. This is a paraphrase of what I was suggesting should be in it. So, okay, so I can't, this is just to give you an idea of what I was thinking that they should be including. And this is very much in line with other UN type language. And what I was trying to do, I wasn't trying to introduce something new and clever and am I so ambitious and so innovative. All those footnote references there under WHO, US, UK, Canada, they're all existing guidance from the governments or the institutions concerned. So there was nothing new I was bringing to the table. And I had hoped naively that would mean there shouldn't be too much pushback and rejection. I was wrong. So this was not accepted. So for me, I have worked in Geneva for 2 years, so I know the horribly convoluted theatrical stage management of these boards and of the documents that go into these boards. And there's usually 90% of the document is padding. And if there are commitments if there's actually a goal that is going to be striven to achieve and way of measuring whether you're achieving that goal, then you've got some leverage. Without that, it's just nice words. And really, a lot of the document is just nice words. So this is why I was trying to ensure that this wasn't a wasted opportunity, that if we had at the highest global level an agreement to work towards safer indoor air in high-risk settings, particularly public health, health provision, health clinical settings, public transport, communal accommodation, places like that, then we'd have a foot in the door at improving and reducing the ongoing infection, reinfection. Now, inside WHO, there were people who were thinking similarly, and they didn't last, unfortunately. So Dr. Sumaya, who you may have known about, she was the previous chief scientific officer, I believe, and she was replaced in 2022 by Dr. Jeremy Farrar, Sir Jeremy Farrar, who came from Wellcome Trust. Wellcome, as you may know, used to be the old name for GlaxoSmithKline Beecham. So that was disappointing that she left, because she was on the right side of the argument. So in terms of looking at the key players, who are the main actors here? So from our perspective, I think, you know, the main institutional voice with WHO is with the Department of Health, who at the moment is the minister is Victoria Atkins, and probably the future minister will be Wes Streeting. Most day-to-day and financial links, technical and financial, are through the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office. No, it was DFID, Department for International Development. And that's, so Andrew Mitchell leads on the development side of things. David Cameron is the Foreign Minister. And in future, we may have Lisa Nandy and David Lammy in those positions. A good contact is Sarah Champion, who was the chair of the Commons International Development Committee. I'm just listing these in case there's interest in taking forward some sort of dialogue about how we collectively, globally, can do better. Because actually, in this case, it was really only the UK that was even trying to put the right things on the table here. So I'm not saying these people are to blame in any way, shape, or form, but these are our sort of political representatives in at the process that we could possibly lean on. Now, the 218 non-state actors, as I mentioned earlier, none are engaged in COVID prevention. None of them seem to have any interest in COVID at all. I did get in touch with one of them, Handicap International, as it used to be called. It's now called Humanity and Inclusion. And they had asked some questions historically about COVID, but they were certainly silent in all of these discussions and all these issues around improving the quality of dialogue or the quality of content in the declaration text. Obviously, there's pharmaceutical representatives in there, but I think we need to be careful. We need to be honest and realistic about what are the incentives for prevention from industry. I mean, you know, by definition, if prevention works, profits go down. So we need to be honest and open about what are the incentives, what are the drivers behind the different individual institutions that actually have a voice in the process. Now, one thing that I had found is that the media was just not focused on this at all. I've written to the Lancet and to to the Guardian. No interest in printing anything I've had to say. Within the Guardian, you probably know we've had some really good stuff from George Monbiot and Francis Ryan. In Scientific American, there's Megan Bartels has written good stuff. For the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, there's Hayley Gleason, her name is. And in the New York Times, there's Apoorva Mandavilli, who's written well, and some good articles in the Irish Examiner by Tess Finch-Lease. The Lancet comes and goes a bit, and it's again from a very clinical perspective, and they haven't really questioned why is this big hole in the current text document, text around prevention and around air quality. Just they've been focused very much on also transfer of technology, access to vaccines and medical resources. So I'm not saying this is a magic bullet at all, but I do think we collectively are maybe missing an opportunity to put pressure on somewhere that could trickle down some of the incentives and some of the leverage. I know there's a lot going on social media, but I don't think it's enough. And I think individual voices, as mine was, just not being listened to or even responded to. And that's why Most institutions involved are very hierarchical. They only listen to what's coming down from above them. So the question in my mind is how to put good COVID-19 response prevention into the accountability chain and into their incentives. I think, we've got, again, I mentioned earlier, media, politicians, civil society, celebrities, and I keep drawing parallels with what was happening to HIV in the 1980s. It was civil society getting organised and making a noise, getting celebrity engagement on the board, because then they dragged it in the media. It became sort of much more public, and it forced the hand of governmental and public health sponsors to start to do the right thing in a way that I think we're still struggling to see happen here. So I think it's currently a missing piece of the jigsaw, but not a magic bullet. I'm very painfully aware we've had decades of climate change COP, the community of practice promises, even with weak actions. But I think that the media attention and the actions that we have had have been very much because of these global promises that governments are embarrassed into at least pretending to take seriously, even if they can't, they just ignore it, as they seem to be currently ignoring COVID-19 and airbrushing out all the evidence that it's going off the rails. And for me personally, I feel extremely sort of shocked still at the absence of the professional bodies' engagement and advocacy, there's a lot of well, I mean, it's something I'm trying to sort of take more focus on in terms of things like the Royal College of Paediatricians and Child Health. They are not saying or doing the right thing despite large amounts of evidence now of how damaging this is to children. Now, I did say earlier, and apologize for jumping about, that I would mention the Global Fund for AIDS, TB and Malaria, which, despite Britain's aid budget being slashed to ribbons a couple of years ago, £1 billion was protected for the Global Fund for AIDS, TB and Malaria. And in their global strategy, 2023-2028, there's this fantastic thing in the context of tuberculosis, which, as you know, spreads in a very similar way to SARS coronavirus 2. There's a very nice, well, not a commitment, but a focus on improving indoor air quality. There has never been any targets to this. There's never been any indicators associated with it, and there's never been any action against it. So that for me has been, well, hang on a minute, why are we not pressing them to deliver on this? And I think we go back again, well, who would press them to deliver on it? It would be the donor governments. Why would they press the Global Fund to deliver on this when they're not doing it themselves? It would just open them up to embarrassment and make very public the contradictions within their own approach. But even the Global Fund at this stage, back in when this was drafted in 2022, was clear this needed to be done, both in terms of tuberculosis and in terms of COVID-19. And I'm sorry to say, no action or progress has been made, and yet nobody's batting an eyelid. And sorry, just the final one I would have mentioned earlier about professional bodies. I personally and asked a series of questions. Where do you stand? What are your position? What's your position? And what are your actions on X, Y, and Z? And those things could be around indoor air quality, or herd immunity, and just to have a snapshot, just to have the evidence for being clear about what they are or aren't doing, because I think in months or years to come it will be an embarrassment, the fact that they have been so feeble and so weak at the time when they were most needed. Sorry, that was at the beginning of a little sort of a score sheet that I was trying to pull together to try and see if we could capture their positions, because they must have discussed and agreed a position on these various things. They just haven't communicated them publicly, because I think it's too embarrassing. Okay, that's all I had to share with you. I'm sorry if I've gone over my 15 minutes, and I'm sorry if it's a bit higgledy-piggledy, but I think you've had a bit of an insight into just what sort of strange things goes on in Geneva at our very highest levels of government, which, yes, it determines where our money goes, where UK taxpayers' money goes, but it determines what sort of commitments and what sort of aims and goals that all governments sign up to. And at the moment, they don't have to do anything. They're all off the hook for doing anything useful. And the way the pandemic accord is currently worded, they will continue to be off the hook. Thank you. I'm happy